imagine a fighter jet that can rip through the sky at Mach 1.5 without ever touching its afterburners. Imagine an airframe completely invisible to the most advanced radar systems on the planet, carrying enough firepower to wipe out an entire enemy squadron before they even realize they are being hunted. That is the promise of the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor. But then, imagine that this exact same aircraft requires over 40 hours of meticulous, agonizing maintenance for every single hour it spends in the air. Imagine a jet that bleeds the defense budget dry at well over $300 million per tail. A jet whose production line was permanently shuttered before it ever fired a single shot in anger against a near-peer adversary. Is this machine the undisputed king of the skies, an untouchable apex predator that absolutely guarantees American air superiority for a generation? Or is it a bloated, fragile hangar queen that represents the single most expensive strategic miscalculation in the history of the Pentagon? If you want to cut through the corporate aerospace propaganda and understand the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of modern warfare, you are in the right place. Welcome back to the War Room, where we dissect military strategy, unpack the hardware, and analyze the doctrine that keeps America in the fight. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and let me know in the comments below if you think the F-22 was worth the staggering price tag, or if we should have just built 1,000 more F-15s instead. To understand the F-22 Raptor, you cannot start in the 21st century. You have to go back to the humid, blood-soaked skies over Hanoi in the late 1960s. The United States military suffered a profound institutional trauma during the Vietnam War. Going into that conflict, American air power doctrine was driven by technological hubris. We fielded the F-4 Phantom, a massive, powerful interceptor that was designed under the assumption that the era of close-quarters dogfighting was dead and buried. The Pentagon believed that future air combat would be entirely beyond visual range, fought with radar-guided missiles like the early AIM-7 Sparrow. Because of this, early F-4 variants did not even have an internal gun. This arrogant assumption collided violently with reality. The early air-to-air missiles failed spectacularly in the dense humidity of Southeast Asia, plagued by fragile electronics and strict rules of engagement that required visual identification of targets. The agile, Soviet-built MiG-17s and MiG-21s of the North Vietnamese Air Force dragged American pilots into turning fights, and the historical American kill ratio, which stood at a dominant 10-to-1 in the Korean War, plummeted to a dismal 2-to-1 in Vietnam. That trauma birthed the F-15 Eagle in the 1970s, a pure, unadulterated air-to-air killer built with the strict design mantra of not a pound for air-to-ground. The Eagle was brilliant, and it remains undefeated in combat. But the Soviet Union was not sitting idle. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, American intelligence agencies caught wind of two new terrifying Soviet fighter programs. These would eventually become the Sukhoi Su-27 Flanker and the Mikoyan MiG-29 Fulcrum. These were not the crude, disposable point defense interceptors of the 1960s. These were heavily armed, aerodynamically brilliant machines designed specifically to hunt and kill American eagles. They featured helmet-mounted sights and off-bore sight missiles that allowed a Soviet pilot to kill an American simply by looking at him, even if the aircraft was not pointed directly at the target. So, what do you do when your absolute best weapon system is suddenly looking over its shoulder at a Soviet counterpart that can outturn it? You change the fundamental rules of the game entirely. In 1981, the United States Air Force initiated the Advanced Tactical Fighter Program, or ATF. The requirements laid out by the brass were nothing short of engineering insanity. They demanded stealth, which at the time was highly experimental and aerodynamically disastrous. The only operational stealth aircraft was the F-117 Nighthawk, which flew like a brick and had zero air-to-air capability. The Air Force also demanded supercruise, which is the ability to sustain supersonic flight without using fuel-guzzling afterburners. They demanded extreme agility, requiring thrust-vectoring engine nozzles. And they demanded advanced avionics capable of fusing data from multiple sensors, giving the pilot a godlike view of the battle space long before the enemy even knew they were there. This was not a request for an evolutionary step in aviation. This was a demand to break the known laws of physics and aerodynamics. The competition came down to two aerospace titans. Lockheed Martin presented the YF-22, and Northrop presented the YF-23. The Northrop YF-23 was a radical diamond-winged marvel. It was arguably stealthier than the Lockheed jet, and it was undeniably faster. It looked like a spaceship designed to slip through radar waves without a whisper. But Lockheed played the political and tactical game with far more aggression. During the flight demonstration phase, Lockheed pilots pushed the YF-22 to the absolute limit, firing live missiles from internal bays while rolling at high speeds and executing high angle of attack maneuvers that showcased the extreme maneuverability provided by its thrust vectoring nozzles. The Air Force brass, still harboring the deep-seated desire for a dogfighter despite the stealth requirements, were mesmerized by the agility of the YF-22. In April 1991, the Lockheed design was declared the winner. But 1991 was also the year the strategic landscape of the world completely shattered. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. The massive Red Army, the very threat the advanced tactical fighter was built to destroy in the skies over the Fulda Gap in Germany, simply ceased to exist. Suddenly, the United States was the sole global hegemon, and the American public demanded a peace dividend. Have you ever tried to buy a custom-built, multi-million-dollar hypercar, but halfway through the manufacturing process, you tell the factory you only want a quarter of the cars, but you still have to pay for the entire research and development facility? That is exactly what happened to the F-22 Raptor. The original Air Force requirement was for 750 Raptors, a fleet large enough to completely replace the F-15 and guarantee global air dominance. But with the Soviet threat gone, the politicians in Washington looked at the price tag and balked. The order was slashed from 750 to 381. Then, as the global war on terror consumed the defense budget with asymmetrical warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan, the order was brutally cut again, this time to just 187 operational aircraft. This drastic reduction in numbers triggered a catastrophic death spiral for the unit cost. When you divide the billions of dollars spent on research, development, and specialized tooling by only 187 airframes, the cost per jet skyrockets into the stratosphere. The production line was officially shut down in 2011, a decision driven by short-term budget constraints rather than long-term strategic vision. Defense Secretary Robert Gates argued that the F-22 had no relevance in the counterinsurgency wars of the Middle East and that the upcoming F-35 Lightning II would be sufficient for future needs. The tooling for the Raptor was supposedly boxed up and stored in a depot in California, but in reality, the highly specialized workforce, the engineers, the titanium welders, the stealth coating technicians, they were all scattered to the winds. The industrial base required to build the world's most advanced air superiority fighter was dismantled. To understand why this is a potential strategic disaster, we have to look at the correlation of forces and the massive shift in global military doctrine. American air superiority doctrine is fundamentally aggressive. It is built on the concept of offensive counter-air operations. We do not wait to fight the enemy over our own cities. We push deep into heavily defended enemy airspace, systematically dismantle their integrated air defense systems, and destroy their fighters on the runway or the exact second their wheels leave the tarmac. The F-22 was tailor-made for this exact mission. It is an invisible sniper that kicks the door down. Contrast this with Russian and Chinese doctrine. Russian doctrine has historically relied on ground-controlled interception and massive, overlapping, deeply layered rings of mobile surface-to-air missiles, like the S-300 and S-400 systems. They view their airspace as a heavily fortified defensive dome. The Chinese People's Liberation Army has taken this concept and evolved it into a highly sophisticated anti-access area denial strategy, commonly known as A2CCD. China has built the Chengdu J-20, a large, heavy, twin-engine stealth fighter. Is the J-20 as agile as the Raptor in a turning fight? Almost certainly not. But dogfighting is not its primary mission. The J-20 is designed with massive internal fuel tanks and carries extremely long-range air-to-air missiles. Chinese doctrine dictates using these stealthy interceptors to bypass American fighters entirely, slipping past the combat air patrols to hunt down and destroy the critical nodes of American air power. They are aiming for the slow, vulnerable E-3 Sentry AWACS radar planes and the massive KC-135 and KC-46 aerial refueling tankers. If your apex predator has a combat radius of only about 500 miles on internal fuel, and the enemy successfully pushes your refueling tankers 1,000 miles away from the battle space using long-range missiles, how exactly does the predator reach the hunting grounds? This is the brutal tyranny of distance in the Pacific theater, and it is a mathematical problem that the F-22 struggles to solve. Let us dive deep into the industrial base and the actual numbers, because wars are not won on Lockheed Martin promotional brochures. Wars are won in the factories and the supply chains. During World War I, the United States industrial machine pumped out over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. The Mustang was a game-changer because it had the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, defeating the Luftwaffe through both superior performance and overwhelming attrition. If a Mustang took a hit and went down over France, there were 10 more rolling off the assembly lines in Michigan the very next day. Now consider the F-22. We only have 187 of them. Of those, a significant portion are dedicated to training squadrons, and others are undergoing deep depot-level maintenance. On any given day, the actual combat-coded, ready-to-fight fleet is terrifyingly small. The supply chain for the Raptors is a logistical nightmare of specialized, highly classified tools. The radar-absorbent material, or RAM, that coats the exterior of the jet and gives it its stealth properties is notoriously fragile. It degrades rapidly in the rain. It degrades in extreme heat. It degrades simply from the immense friction generated by flying at supersonic speeds. Maintaining the stealth profile of a Raptor is just like turning a wrench on a traditional fighter jet, and much more like performing delicate neurosurgery in a climate-controlled clean room. For every single hour the F-22 spends in the air, it requires over 40 hours of maintenance on the ground. The mission-capable rate, which is the percentage of the fleet actually ready to fly a combat mission at any given moment, frequently hovers around 50%. That means if a fighter squadron deploys with 24 jets, the squadron commander might only be able to put 12 of them in the air on the opening night of a major conflict. Think back to the German Tiger tank in World War I. The Tiger was an absolute technological marvel of its time. It was heavily armored, and it carried a devastating 88mm gun that could destroy anything the American or Soviet armies fielded from miles away. In a one-on-one fight, the Tiger was virtually unbeatable. But it was massively over-engineered. It was mechanically unreliable, completely unsuited for harsh environments, and practically impossible to produce in sufficient numbers. The American Shermans and the Soviet TD-34s were technologically inferior in a one-on-one duel, but they overwhelmed the German armor through sheer, brutal numbers, logistical simplicity, and rapid battlefield repairability. Are we repeating the exact same Tiger tank fallacy in the skies of the 21st century? When you look at the raw specifications of the F-22, it is easy to be blinded by the brilliance of the engineering. The aircraft is powered by two Pratt & Whitney F119 PW100 turbofan engines. Each of these massive power plants produces 30,000 pounds of thrust. That gives the Raptor a thrust-to-weight ratio significantly greater than 1-to-1 at standard combat weight. This means the jet can point its nose straight up at the sky and accelerate vertically against the force of gravity. The radar is the ANCA PG-77, an active electronically scanned array system that can track multiple enemy targets at ranges exceeding 120 miles. It can jam enemy electronics, act as a localized intelligence hub, and guide weapons with terrifying precision, all while the aircraft itself presents a radar cross-section roughly the size of a steel marble. Hidden inside its internal weapons base to maintain that flawless stealth profile, it carries 6 AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders for close-in work. It is, without a doubt, a masterpiece of aerospace engineering. But a masterpiece sitting quietly in a climate-controlled hangar does not win wars. The theoretical dominance calculated on a Pentagon spreadsheet is one thing. What happens when this fragile, hyper-expensive marvel of modern engineering is pulled out of the pristine hangars of Langley Air Force Base, thrust into the unforgiving, dirty, chaotic environment of forward deployment, and tasked with executing complex tactical maneuvers against a thinking, adapting, heavily armed enemy. The transition from the drawing board to the blood, sweat, and chaos of the modern battlespace is where the true test begins. And as we are about to see, the tactical reality of the Raptor is far darker and far more complicated than the brochures ever promised. Let us step inside the cockpit and examine the kill chain of the F-22 Raptor to understand exactly how this machine operates in the unforgiving reality of modern combat. The foundational pillar of this aircraft is not its raw speed or its maneuverability, but its unprecedented ability to see without being seen. Traditional fighter radars operate much like a high-powered spotlight in a pitch-black room. If you turn it on, you might illuminate your target, but you instantly broadcast your exact location to every other enemy operating in the dark. The Raptor changes this dynamic entirely by utilizing the ANC PG-77 Active Electronically Scanned Array, or AESA radar. This system employs highly classified, low probability of intercept technology. Instead of blasting a massive continuous wave of electromagnetic energy, the APG-77 fires thousands of pencil-thin, rapidly shifting frequency pulses per second. It paints the enemy aircraft, gathers the telemetry, and shuts off before the enemy's radar warning receiver can even register that it has been scanned. It is the electronic equivalent of a ghost whispering in your ear. Coupled with the active radar is the ANCA LR-94 passive receiver system. This is arguably the most devastating and highly classified piece of hardware on the entire jet. It consists of an array of over 30 separate antennas blended seamlessly into the wings and fuselage, providing a full 360-degree spherical coverage of the battle space. The ALR-94 can detect, track, and pinpoint enemy radar emissions from over 250 miles away. Long before the APG-77 radar even needs to emit a single pulse, the passive sensors have already built a complete three-dimensional map of the electronic environment. The American pilot is not looking at raw, confusing data feeds. They are looking at a fused, God's eye view displayed on massive liquid crystal displays. The onboard computers categorize threats, calculate weapon intercept geometry, and essentially tell the pilot exactly who needs to die first. But seeing the target is only half the battle. You still have to put steel on target. The primary weapon of the Raptor is the AIM-120D Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missile. Because the F-22 must maintain its flawless stealth profile at all times, it cannot carry weapons on external wing pylons like a traditional fighter. The missiles are housed entirely inside 3 internal weapons bays. When the pilot pulls the trigger, a complex hydraulic trapeze mechanism, the LAU-142 SAE AMRAR-AM vertical eject launcher, violently throws the 600-pound missile out of the belly of the aircraft at over 25 feet per second. The bay doors snap open, the missile is ejected clear of the airframe, and the doors slam shut again in less than 1 single second. This rapid sequence is absolutely critical to survivability. For that tiny fraction of a second, the stealth profile is broken, and the aircraft flares up on enemy radar screens like a brilliant beacon. If the doors jam, or if they take too long to close, the Raptor is suddenly visible, highly vulnerable, and likely dead. Furthermore, the F-22 imparts immense kinematic energy to its weapons, giving them a massive lethal advantage. If you fire an AMRAAM from a standard F-16 flying at Mach 0.9 at 20,000 feet, the missile has to burn a massive amount of its own solid rocket fuel just to climb and accelerate to intercept speed. The Raptor fires that exact same missile while supercruising at Mach 1.5 at 50,000 feet in the thin, frigid air of the upper atmosphere. The missile starts its journey already traveling at supersonic speeds, acting essentially as a second stage to a rocket. This drastically increases the no-escape zone, which is the mathematical cone in the sky where the enemy aircraft cannot physically outturn or outrun the incoming weapon. But what happens when the invisible sniper is dragged out of the shadows and forced into a knife fight in a phone booth? Despite its beyond visual range dominance, the Air Force brass demanded the F-22 be an apex dogfighter. This is where the Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines and their thrust vectoring nozzles come into play. Unlike modern Russian fighters like the Su-35, which use three-dimensional thrust vectoring that can move the Azus in any direction, the Raptor uses two-dimensional vectoring. The exhaust nozzles only move up and down along the pitch axis 20 degrees in either direction. While this seems like a distinct disadvantage on paper, it was a deliberate engineering choice to maintain the stealth profile of the rear of the jet. In a visual merge, the Raptor can perform maneuvers that entirely defy aerodynamic logic. It can execute the J-turn or the Herbst maneuver, pulling its nose up to a staggering 60-degree angle of attack while still moving forward, rapidly pointing its internal M61A2 20mm Vulcan rotary cannon at the enemy. However, these extreme high-alpha maneuvers come with a brutal physiological and tactical cost. When you throw a 60,000-pound block of titanium and composite materials into a post-stall maneuver, you act as a massive flying air brake. You bleed airspeed at a terrifying rate. If you miss that first cannon shot, you are now hanging in the sky, slow, totally out of energy, and incredibly vulnerable to the enemy's wingman. It is a high-stakes gamble that requires absolute perfection. We saw this exact dynamic play out over the Yalu River during the Korean War. The American F-86 Sabre was often outperformed in raw climb rate and turn radius by the lighter, higher-flying Soviet MiG-15. But the Sabre pilots utilized superior energy management tactics, better radar gun sights, and mutual wingman support to achieve a dominant kill ratio. The Raptor is designed to rely on its sensors and kinetic energy, but if it gets dragged into a turning fight where it bleeds all its speed, it suddenly becomes just another piece of metal falling out of the sky. And we absolutely cannot ignore the human element, the fragile biological component sitting at the center of this technological marvel. Flying the Raptor is an incredibly violent physical experience. Pulling 9 Gs in a dogfight means a 200-pound pilot suddenly weighs 1,800 pounds. The blood rapidly drains from the brain, vision narrows into a dark tunnel, and the G-suit viciously squeezes the legs and abdomen to keep the pilot conscious. But the F-22 had a darker, more insidious problem that nearly crippled the entire fleet. It was known as the Raptor cough. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, F-22 pilots began experiencing severe hypoxia-like symptoms in the cockpit. They were suffering from extreme dizziness, confusion, and a bizarre hacking cough after routine flights. In 2010, Captain Jeff Haney was tragically killed when his F-22 crashed into the Alaskan wilderness after he seemingly lost consciousness due to an oxygen system failure. The primary culprit was suspected to be the onboard oxygen generating system, or OBOGS. Instead of carrying heavy liquid oxygen tanks, the jet bleeds hot air from the engines, filters it, and feeds it directly to the pilot. Toxins and exhaust fumes were allegedly making their way into the cockpit breathing apparatus. The entire fleet was grounded. Millions of dollars were spent investigating the issue. The Air Force eventually blamed a faulty valve in the pilot's pressure vest that was restricting breathing under high G-forces, but many pilots remained deeply skeptical. The aircraft was physically breaking the very men and women trained to fly it. Let us transition from the sterile testing grounds of Nevada to the brutal, chaotic reality of combat operations. The F-22 finally saw its combat debut not against a peer state military in the Pacific, but in the skies over Syria in 2014, dropping precision-guided bombs on ISIS targets. But the real test, the crucible that proved the Raptor's tactical worth, began in 2017 along the Euphrates River. The river served as a tense deconfliction line between American-backed forces on the eastern bank and Russian-backed Syrian regime forces on the western bank. The airspace over eastern Syria quickly became the most congested, dangerous, and heavily monitored patch of sky on the planet. Russian aerospace forces were constantly probing the line, flying Su-24 Fencer bombers and Su-25 Frogfoot attack jets directly toward American ground troops. The rules of engagement were incredibly strict. American pilots could not simply fire an AMRAAM from 50 miles away based on a radar blip. They had to achieve positive visual identification to ensure they were not shooting down a civilian airliner or an Allied jet. This strict protocol completely negated the Raptor's primary advantage of beyond visual range stealth. The invisible sniper was forced to walk up and tap the enemy on the shoulder. If you possess a weapon system designed specifically to kill from 100 miles away, why are you risking a $300 million airframe at a range where a stray 30mm cannon shell could bring it down? because the geopolitical stakes demanded it. The encounters over the Euphrates were intense, daily occurrences. An American AWACS would detect a Russian strike package approaching the deconfliction line. The Raptor would drop down from its high-altitude perch, slipping entirely through the radar coverage of the Russian S-400 surface-to-air missile batteries stationed in western Syria. The American pilot would approach the Russian formation entirely undetected. The Russian radar warning receivers remained completely silent. The F-22 would pull up directly alongside the Russian bomber, close enough for the pilots to make actual eye contact. It was a terrifying psychological weapon. The Russian pilot would look out the canopy and suddenly see a massive gray twin-engine fighter flying perfectly in formation just feet away, having appeared out of thin air. The situation escalated dramatically when the Russians began sending their top-tier air superiority fighter, the Su-35 Flanker E, to escort their bombers. The Su-35 is a highly maneuverable, heavily armed beast. We now had the apex predators of the East and the West circling each other in a deadly, high-speed ballet over the Syrian desert. The F-22s would use their thrust vectoring to aggressively maneuver around the Su-35s, dropping brilliant flares across their noses to force them away from American ground troops. These were not traditional dogfights with missiles flying, but they were vicious, close-quarters kinematic battles for positional dominance. The F-22s consistently outmaneuvered the flankers, establishing a dominant, undeniable presence. But the real victory in Syria was not kinetic, it was electronic. The F-22 used its ALR-94 passive sensors to act as a massive flying vacuum cleaner for electronic intelligence. Every single time a Russian Su-35 turned on its Airbus-E radar, every time a Syrian S-200 surface-to-air missile battery scanned the sky, the Raptor recorded the exact frequency, pulse repetition interval, and waveform. The F-22 was meticulously mapping the entire Russian electronic order of battle in the Middle East, feeding that highly classified data back to the Pentagon to update the threat libraries for every other aircraft in the American inventory. However, this operational success masked a grueling logistical nightmare. Deploying the F-22 to forward bases like Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates exposed the extreme fragility of the airframe. The Middle Eastern summer is unforgiving. Temperatures on the tarmac routinely exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun beats down mercilessly and the air is filled with fine, abrasive desert sand. This environment is absolute poison to the Raptor's specialized radar-absorbent material. The stealth coating began to crack, peel, and melt under the intense heat and friction of daily combat patrols. The ground crews, the unsung heroes of the Air Force, worked grueling 24-hour shifts in stifling, climate-controlled portable hangars just to keep the jets flying. Every time an F-22 landed, it required hours of meticulous inspection. If a simple access panel had to be opened to fix a routine hydraulic leak, the stealth taping and coating around that panel had to be painstakingly scraped off, reapplied, and allowed to cure for hours before the jet could legally fly again. The maintenance man-hours per flight hour skyrocketed. The Air Force was bleeding resources just to keep a handful of jets operational in a counterinsurgency theater where the enemy had absolutely no air force. This mirrors the tragic misuse of the F-104 Starfighter during the early days of the Vietnam War. The Starfighter was a high-altitude, Mach 2 interceptor designed specifically to shoot down fast-flying Soviet nuclear bombers. But in Vietnam, it was forced down into the tactical mud, flying low-altitude ground attack and escort missions. Its high-speed advantages were entirely useless, its short range was a massive liability, and it suffered losses to ground fire and technical failures. We were using a scalpel to chop wood. The F-22 in Syria was performing a mission that an F-15 or an F-16 could have done for a fraction of the cost and maintenance burden. The Raptor proved it could dominate the close quarters, shadowboxing matches over the deserts of the Middle East, but bullying Russian bombers and mapping Syrian radar sites is absolute child's play compared to the storm that is brewing on the horizon. The true nightmare scenario for the Pentagon is not a localized skirmish in the desert. The ultimate test of the F-22 Raptor was thousands of miles away, across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where the tyranny of distance, a highly sophisticated peer adversary, and the terrifying reality of a massive coordinated missile barrage threatened to ground the invisible fleet before they even fire a single shot. The Pacific theater is a logistical nightmare that fundamentally breaks the operational paradigm the F-22 Raptor was originally born into. When the Advanced Tactical Fighter program was conceived in the 1980s, the battleground was envisioned as the relatively compact airspace over Central Europe. The F-22 was designed to launch from heavily fortified, established airbases in West Germany or the United Kingdom, fly a few hundred miles to the Fulda Gap, obliterate waves of Soviet MiGs, and return home for maintenance. The geography of the Indo-Pacific, however, is a completely different beast, characterized by vast, unforgiving stretches of open ocean where the tyranny of distance dictates every single tactical decision. The distance from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam to the Taiwan Strait is roughly 1,700 miles. The distance from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa to the airspace over Taipei is about 400 miles. The F-22 Raptor, for all its aerodynamic brilliance, has a combat radius of only about 500 to 600 nautical miles when flying stealthily on internal fuel. It simply does not have the legs to cross the Pacific without massive continuous support. This brings us to the terrifying reality of the modern Chinese People's Liberation Army rocket force. China has spent the last 2 decades meticulously building an arsenal specifically designed to exploit the short range of American tactical fighters. They have deployed thousands of intermediate-range ballistic missiles, most notably the DF-26, often referred to by military analysts as the Guam Killer. These are solid-fueled, road-mobile missiles that can be launched from deep within the Chinese mainland, carrying massive conventional or nuclear warheads with pinpoint terminal guidance. In the opening hours of a Pacific conflict, the Chinese doctrine does not call for an immediate air-to-air fighter sweep. Their doctrine calls for a massive, overwhelming missile barrage aimed directly at the runways, fuel depots, and maintenance hangars of Kadena, Misawa, and Andersen. We have seen this exact catastrophic scenario play out in American military history before. On December the 8th, 1941, just hours after the devastating surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, General Douglas MacArthur's Far East Air Force was caught completely flat-footed on the ground at Clark Field in the Philippines. Despite having received warnings of the outbreak of war, a breakdown in command and control left clusters of American B-17 Flying Fortresses and P-40 Warhawks parked wingtip to wingtip on the tarmac. Japanese Zeros and Betty bombers swept in from Formosa and decimated the American air fleet before the pilots could even spin up their propellers. That catastrophic failure of early warning and base defense effectively handed total air superiority to the Japanese Empire for years, dooming the American garrison in the Philippines. Today, the modern Pentagon looks at the satellite imagery of the Chinese rocket force and sees the exact same ominous shadow falling over our Pacific bases. If your $300 million stealth fighter requires a perfectly paved 10,000-foot runway and a massive climate-controlled maintenance hangar, how exactly do you operate it when the enemy turns your primary airbase into a small soldering landscape of shattered concrete? To counter this existential threat, the United States Air Force has desperately pivoted to a new logistical doctrine known as Agile Combat Employment, or ACE. The concept is to avoid keeping all of our eggs in one basket by disperse small packages of F-22s to austere, remote airstrips scattered across the Pacific, such as the tiny islands of Palau, Tinian, and Saipan. Instead of operating from massive super Zs, the Raptors would play a deadly shell game, constantly hopping from island to island to avoid being targeted by Chinese ballistic missiles. This is a direct strategic echo of Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur's brutal island-hopping campaign during the Second World War. We bled for tiny, seemingly insignificant islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa not for their political value, but specifically to secure the flat coral real estate required to build runways for the B-29 Superfortresses and P-51 Mustangs. The United States Navy Seabees performed absolute logistical miracles, carving operational airstrips out of the dense, malarial jungle overnight. Today, the Air Force is trying to relearn those exact same austere, expeditionary skills, but they are attempting to do it with an aircraft that is exponentially more demanding than a rugged, piston-engine fighter. The logistical tether required to support an F-22 in a remote location is staggeringly heavy. You cannot simply land a Raptor on a dirt strip, pump it full of gas, and send it back into the fight. The aircraft requires specialized liquid cooling carts just to keep its advanced avionics from melting down on the tarmac. It requires specialized auxiliary power units to start the engines. It requires highly classified diagnostic computers, climate-controlled tents, and specialized radar-absorbent tape to repair the stealth coating after every single flight. A massive C-17 Globemaster II cargo plane can only carry the support gear and maintenance personnel for a tiny handful of Raptors. Moving an F-22 squadron across the Pacific requires an armada of heavy airlift, and those slow, lumbering cargo planes are prime targets for long-range enemy interceptors. Furthermore, because of the Raptor's short combat radius, it is entirely dependent on a massive fleet of KC-135 Stratotankers and KC-46 Pegasus aerial refueling aircraft. The F-22 cannot fight over the South China Sea without a tanker waiting for it safely outside the threat ring. The Chinese military understands this Achilles heel perfectly. The Chengdu J-20 stealth fighter was not designed to dogfight the F-22. It was designed to bypass it. The J-20 carries the PL-15 Beyond Visual Range air-to-air missile, which utilizes dual-pulse solid rocket motor, giving it an estimated range of over 120 miles. Chinese tactical doctrine dictates using their stealth interceptors to hunt down and destroy the American tankers and AWACS radar planes. If the tankers go down, the F-22s run out of fuel and crash into the ocean. It is a terrifying, scientifically simple, mathematically sound strategy to defeat the most advanced fighter on Earth without ever engaging it directly. When we analyze the F-22 from an economic and political perspective, the tragedy of the program becomes even more apparent. The decision made by Defense Secretary Robert Gates in 2009 to cap the production line at 187 aircraft was heavily influenced by the ongoing counterinsurgency wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Pentagon was bleeding money to buy mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, or MRAPs, to survive improvised explosive devices in the desert. In that specific geopolitical moment, on spending billions on a specialized air superiority fighter to counter a non-existent Soviet threat seemed like a massive waste of taxpayer dollars. But geopolitics shift rapidly, and defense industrial capacity cannot be turned back on like a light switch. Because we only built 100 airframes, we have absolutely no strategic depth. In a high-intensity conflict over Taiwan, combat losses are a mathematical certainty. Even if the F-22 achieves an astounding kill ratio of 20-1, if we lose 10 Raptors to a lucky missile barrage or a chaotic dogfight, that is over 5% of the entire combat-coded fleet wiped out in a single afternoon. And because the production line was dismantled, the specialized tooling destroyed, and the workforce scattered, we cannot build replacements. Once a Raptor is shot down, it is gone forever. We have seen this exact tragic arc before with the legendary Grumman F-14 Tomcat. The Tomcat was a massive twin-engine, swing-wing interceptor built to defend American aircraft carriers from swarms of Soviet bombers using the ultra-long-range AIM-54 Phoenix missile. It was an absolute masterpiece of Cold War engineering. But the Tomcat was a notorious maintenance nightmare, requiring over 50 hours of agonizing wrench-turning by exhausted sailors for every single hour of flight time. When the Cold War ended, the United States Navy simply could not justify the exorbitant cost of keeping the aging, specialized fleet in the air. They unceremoniously retired the Tomcat in favor of the slower, less glamorous but infinitely more reliable and multi-role FCA-18 Super Hornet. The F-22 is currently staring down the exact same barrel of harsh economic reality. The cost per flight hour of an F-22 is estimated to be somewhere between $70,000 and $80,000. Compare that to an F-16 Fighting Falcon, which costs roughly $22,000 per hour to fly. The Air Force is currently fighting a bitter political battle with Congress because the military actually wants to retire 32 of the older Block 20 F-22s. These early production jets are used entirely for training and lack the modern avionics and weapons integration of the newer Block 30 and Block 35 aircraft. Upgrading these 32 jets to modern combat standards would cost the Pentagon over $3 billion, a price tag the Air Force brass argues is simply not worth it. They would rather take that money and invest it in the highly classified Next Generation Air Dominance Program, or NGAD, which aims to field a sixth-generation fighter alongside a fleet of autonomous, artificial intelligence-driven loyal wingman drones. This internal conflict highlights the ultimate paradox of the Raptor. It is simultaneously the most lethal fighter jet on the planet and an aging, unsustainable financial burden. It is fighting a shadow war against an adversary that has already stolen its secrets. Through massive cyber espionage campaigns over the last 2 decades, Chinese intelligence agencies successfully hacked into the servers of American defense contractors, stealing terabytes of highly classified data regarding stealth coatings, sensor fusion, and engine designs from both the F-35 and F-22 programs. The Chinese J-20 did not emerge from a vacuum. It was built on the foundation of stolen American research and development. The invisible sniper is now facing an enemy that has already read its playbook. So is the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor the undisputed legend of air superiority, or is it America's most expensive strategic mistake? The brutal, objective truth is that it is both. It is an absolute masterpiece of aerospace engineering that successfully deterred a generation of adversaries simply by existing. No nation on Earth wanted to risk a conventional war with the United States, knowing that the Raptor was lurking in the upper atmosphere. But it is also a profound strategic miscalculation, because the Pentagon built a silver bullet and then threw away the gun. We built a hyper-specialized, hyper-expensive thoroughbred that requires a pristine logistical environment to operate, and we are now facing a brutal, muddy, long-range missile war where numbers, reliability, and logistical endurance matter far more than raw kinematic performance. The F-22 will undoubtedly dominate any airspace it enters, but the terrifying question remains whether it will have the fuel, the bases, and the numbers to enter that airspace in the first place. War is not simply a contest of who has the fastest jet. It is a brutal, exhausting test of which nation can sustain violence the longest under the most punishing conditions imaginable. The Raptor is a beautiful sword, but a sword is entirely useless if the arm wielding it is starved of blood. What do you think is the ultimate legacy of the F-22 Raptor? Let me know in the comments below by choosing one of the following options. A. It is the undisputed king of the skies, and we should have built all 750 of them, regardless of the cost. B. It was a massive waste of money, and we should have invested those billions into upgrading our existing F-15 and F-16 fleets. C. It served its purpose as a deterrent, but its time has passed and we need to focus entirely on sixth-generation drones and long-range missiles.